Hello, everybody. I hope everybody is okay, feeling well, taking care of yourself and to the others. Today, we have the pleasure to have here Sean Raymond. Sean got his PhD from the University of of Washington, and is currently in the more than a decade working in the Observatoire de Bordeaux in France. And Sean is very well known for his, he is one of the great expertise in planetary formation in terms of solar system and extrasolar planets too. So Sean, welcome for our seminars. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks, it's good to be here, and sorry for the technical problems, and I appreciate the transition to Zoom to make it so that I could present. So anyhow, I'm going to tell you guys today about a new paper that just came out last month, and it's all about the solar system's dynamical instability. And you can see it's the main author is Beibei Liu, who's based in China, and it's along with Seth Jacobson, who's based at Michigan State in the US. And I should mention that a lot of this was inspired by discussions with others, notably Andre Isidoro from Guaratinguetá and Rogerio de Lleno as well. All right, so let's get going. So this is the cartoon version of the outer solar system, right? And so presently we got the 4 giant planets and a belt of other stuff further out, the Kuiper belt. And the present day Kuiper belt, you know, the census is not complete on exactly how many objects are in it, but estimates are that it contains a total of something like a Mars mass in material. So, about 1/10 of an Earth mass and stuff. But the orbital, distributions are relatively excited. And I'm not going to go into the details of that right now. The key thing is that the current Kuiper belt does not look like a nice pristine belt of planetesimals left over from planet formation. It looks like something that got kicked around a lot. And there's objects in there that are a little bigger than you would expect to be able to form from a disk that, from a little ring or a disk that has only 1/10 of an Earth mass. And so it's generally thought that back in the past, when the planets formed at time 0, in quotes, the belt was more massive. Exactly how massive is quite hard to constrain. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But at least a few Earth masses of stuff, up to some people have estimated a lot more, maybe 10s or 100 Earth masses. Okay? So we think there was probably more stuff there in the past. And really, this all is kind of a prelude to some of the most dynamic stuff in solar system dynamics over the past several decades has been this realization that the solar system was not always like it is today, especially the outer solar system. And the outer planets' orbits probably shifted due to 2 processes. The first being planetesimal-driven migration, and the second being dynamical instability. So let me just kind of give a little bit of background on these. So first, in terms of the dynamical instability part, a lot of this came from the study of exoplanets. And so the distribution of giant exoplanets shows a very broad distribution of eccentricities. A lot of exoplanets have very excited orbits, very large eccentricities. And, why is this? Well, we think that this was sculpted by 2 kind of key processes. We think that gas giant planets generally form on nice circular orbits, like Jupiter in this picture, and they can migrate inward. And their orbits can also become excited because of planet scattering. These are instabilities. So in this little tiny cartoon, there's 2 concentric circles, meaning that 2 giant planets formed around 1 star. Then their orbits started to cross. Then one was ejected, and the survivor ended up on an eccentric orbit. So its orbital eccentricity was lifted in this diagram by this planet-planet scattering event. The other process is planetesimal-driven migration. And planetesimal-driven migration was first recognized, a long time ago, almost 40 years ago. This is one of a really cool kind of foundational papers. This paper by Fernandez and Ip in 1984. And what they showed is that an outer planetesimal disk should have caused the giant planet's orbits to spread out. And so why is that? It's basically just a back reaction effect. So every time a planetesimal scatters off a planet, the planetesimal goes flying, but the planet gets a small nudge in orbital angular momentum as well. And the net effect of this is to cause, if a planet is scattering planetesimals inward, that planet's orbit goes outward a little bit. And what was recognized is, the net effect of this is that the outer planets, Uranus and Neptune's orbits generally get wider by this process, whereas Jupiter's planet gets smaller. Jupiter's orbit gets smaller, sorry. And Saturn actually gets wider as well. And so the reason for that is that in modeling this process, it turns out that Jupiter does most of the ejecting, whereas the other planets kind of just feed planetesimals inward to Jupiter. So the other planets kick planetesimals inward, so they each get kind of pushed outward a tiny little bit, and then Jupiter ejects things and gets pushed inward. Right? That's the general outcome of planetesimal-driven migration. In 1993, Malhotra showed that this kind of fit a different picture too. It's Pluto's orbit, which is in 2 to 3 resonance with Neptune, can be explained if Neptune migrated outward. And so planetesimal-driven migration might have been doing the migrating and capturing Pluto on its current orbit. And Gomez in 2003 showed that other aspects of the Kuiper belt, in particular the hot population with relatively excited inclinations, could have been excited from the outward migration of Neptune. And what this diagram shows is just what I was talking about before. It's this very simple concept. The key concept is just that planetesimal-driven migration causes the planet's orbits to spread out. So you can see in this simulation, the planetesimal disk is not shown. I had to color it in blue. And they used a disk of 50 Earth masses in this paper by Hahn and Malhotra. And you can see that Neptune migrates outward, Uranus migrates outward. It's a little harder to see, but Saturn is going outward as well. And Jupiter, because of its large mass, is moving much less, but it's moving inward a little bit. Now, here's a slide that's just kind of demonstrating the dynamical instability part of things. So this is really going along with what on the previous slide about the instabilities in planetary systems. So what this is showing is the outcome of planet-planet scattering in a system with 2 giant planets. And I include this just to this is supposed to explain the eccentricity distribution of giant planets, giant exoplanets specifically. This idea of planet-planet scattering, these very violent dynamical instabilities, was developed to explain that plot I showed before of the eccentricity distribution. And so what you saw is that one planet got ejected by this very strong instability, and the surviving planet has a stretched out eccentric orbit, which was put there by this instability. It's kind of a scar from this violent past. And among the exoplanet eccentricities, basically at least 3/4, if not much more, of all giant exoplanet systems had to have gone unstable in the past to explain the eccentricities that we see today. And so instability is a very common thing. And I think, I don't have any official confirmation of this, but I believe that exoplanets and this kind of study is really what seeded the idea of instability in the solar system in the first place. Okay. So the first paper that I'm aware of anyway, that modeled an instability, a dynamical instability in the solar system was by Thomas et al. In 1999. And they proposed that the ice giants formed basically between Jupiter and Saturn, between like 5 and 10 AU. I think they even did some models where they formed just interior to Jupiter. But basically the ice giants formed in Jupiter-Saturn region. There's a dynamical instability that destabilized their orbits, and they were kicked outward. But they weren't just ejected like we saw in the previous plot, in the animation. Rather, they were ejected outward into this disk of planetesimals. And the disk that they assumed in this paper was very massive. It was between 1 and 200 Earth masses. And so that disk had enough angular momentum to basically capture these scattered ice giants and recircularize their orbits to a large degree. And the final systems that formed there ended up looking a lot like the solar system. So like in this example. Okay? So it's kind of cool. It's a nice model, instability. Of course, this was all lead up to kind of the one that we all know and love, the Nice model, right? That was developed in Nice in France by Alessandro Morbidelli, Rodney Gomez, Hal Levison, and Manios Tsiganis. And so the Nice model invokes kind of a combination of planetesimal-driven migration and instability. And the cool thing in the Nice model is it assumed the planet's orbits started closer together. And then the giant planet's orbits, like we talked about, basically planetesimal-driven migration causes the orbits to spread apart because Jupiter's going inward and the other planets are going outward. So especially Jupiter and Saturn are moving apart. And the instability trigger that was assumed in the Nice model, at least the first version of it, was Jupiter and Saturn crossing the 2-to-1 mean motion resonance. And so in this plot of the evolution in the Nice model, you can see I had to paint in again where the assumed primordial planetesimal disk lives between about 20 and 30 AU or so. Jupiter and Saturn's orbits, the J and the S there, are kind of moving along. You can't even see them moving, but they are very slowly spreading apart as planetesimals are scattered. They hit a kind of critical point where they enter the 2-to-1 resonance, and it's when they go just beyond it, after entering it, that there's a big kick in eccentricity that destabilizes, in this case, the ice giants, and they scatter off each other. And in this example, Uranus and Neptune actually flip order and, you know, get recircularized by the planetesimal disk. And in the end, the final system looks a lot like the present day solar system. It's a quite nice model, right? And one of the main motivations for the model at the start was to explain a delayed event. And so at the time, there was an event that was assumed to have existed called the terminal lunar cataclysm, or the late heavy bombardment sometimes. People who study this stuff don't like the word late heavy bombardment. They prefer terminal lunar cataclysm because it's more precise. But I always knew it as the late heavy bombardment. But anyway, so the late heavy bombardment is shown in this plot on the right. I don't know if you can see my mouse. Can you guys see my mouse? Yes.
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So it's in this plot on the right is the kind of the early interpretation of the late heavy bombardment. And so this is kind of the y-axis in this plot on the right is the impact flux on, I think it's on the moon. Yeah, I guess it's got to be on the moon because they're showing specific basins. And so according to the thinking of the time, the impact flux went down. But then to explain certain large basins on the moon, you know, like Imbrium in particular, there had to be a late flux of impactors. And so the impact flux went down in the solar system. Everything was nice and calm. But then things went crazy. There was this terminal lunar cataclysm. Something changed in the solar system. And then after that, the impact flux went back down. And so that was interpreted as evidence for the Nice model instability with a delayed trigger. So on the image on the left here, you can see is the same kind of evolution of the Nice model, where Jupiter and Saturn only cross their 2-to-1 resonance after a long delay. And that's possible in certain situations if the parameters are just right. So it can work, and you know, you can't dispute it. We don't know what those parameters were, but anyway, in this example, you can see the planet's orbits are gently spreading apart, and after about 800 million years, Jupiter and Saturn cross the 2-to-1 resonance and the instability happens. And so the Nice model was an elegant way to explain the terminal lunar cataclysm. It was a really successful model. And in time, the Nice model itself has evolved quite a bit. So one key thing was the initial conditions of the orbits of the giant planets in the original version were kind of ad hoc. They were more compact, but you know, just toss planets wherever you want to make things work out. But in revising this, there was more of a reason to put planets in certain orbits, and what orbits should they choose? It was generally chosen to match, the outcome of migration of planets within the gas disk. So kind of to match the previous chapter in the story to make everything fit. And this plot is just showing one example of doing that from a paper by Morbidelli et al. In 2007, where they kind of built in hydrodynamical modeling, this chain of orbital resonances to have consistent, initial conditions that made some sense. And, from those types of initial conditions, they could still get Nice model type behavior. This is basically the outcome of the same Nice model starting from those initial conditions with the planets in a resonant chain, and they can get the same type of evolution where Jupiter and Saturn would sometimes cross slightly different resonances, but this, qualitatively the same type of behavior still happened. And another evolution of this came from Nesvorny in about 10 years ago, who proposed that there was an extra ice giant or two. And so this seems kind of weird. Why are you going to throw an extra ice giant in there? But there's a good reason for it. And the reason is simply that the Nice model is not very efficient. Dynamical instabilities like to eject planets, like we saw in that movie of the exoplanet instability. Dynamical instabilities usually eject one planet. So if you're going to finish with 4 planets, it's a lot easier to finish with 4 if you start with 5, or even 6 sometimes, but at least 5. And so let's see, let's start this animation. So this is an animation done by Nesvorny. The orbits here of the 4 giant planets with one extra one that you saw when the instability just happened. It slowed down for a second. You could see that one ice giant was ejected from the system entirely. So that was another kind of addition to the Nice model. And the Nice model has been quite nicely put together. And if you kind of want to show exactly what it can explain, it's the following. Maybe its biggest strength is that it can explain that giant planets orbits quite well. And so what this is showing is, this plot shows the orbital eccentricity and inclination versus semi-major axis of a bunch of simulations. Those are the kind of the little circles versus the actual planets, which are these little triangles. And so overall, it looks really good. Oh, sorry, was there a comment? No. Right. So overall, this looks good. You can get all the planets are in about the right place. That looks nice. The Nice model can also explain a bunch of small body populations. One of the most kind of powerful explanations is it can explain why the Trojans of Jupiter have such a broad inclination distribution, because they're captured during the process. It can also explain the capture of irregular satellites of the giant planets. And a lot of progress has been made in terms of explaining the orbital structure of the Kuiper belt. So the Nice model can explain a lot of these different things. And so this instability is very powerful. It's got a couple of challenges, though, the Nice model. So one that you may have noticed if you squinted at one of the plots I showed on the previous slide is that it's hard to excite Jupiter's eccentricity. It's not like it's impossible. It's just kind of like right at the edge of the outcomes, the typical outcomes. And so what this plot is showing is M55 is kind of a measure of Jupiter's eccentricity as a function of the Jupiter to Saturn period ratio. So each dot is one computer simulation of the Nice model. And this is where Jupiter and Saturn ended up. And so they end up kind of all over the place. But where the actual Jupiter and Saturn are the red star here. And so you can see there's some dots that fall about in the right spot, but there's not a lot. Right. So it's kind of one of these things it's okay. Sometimes it works, but it's rare. One possible solution that works pretty well, actually, is if Jupiter's eccentricity was a little bit excited before the instability. That might fix this a little bit. This is kind of a detail. It's not too important for this talk, but it's something to be aware of. Another kind of bigger problem for the Nice model that was pointed out very strongly by Cave and Chambers was that a late instability, if the giant planets went unstable late, the terrestrial planets were already completely formed. And the giant planet instability almost universally disrupts the orbits of the terrestrial planets. So here's one example of that. So what you can see in this plot on the right is basically on the top is the giant planet's orbits doing a Nice model type instability. You can see that innermost ice giant was ejected. And in the bottom, those are the terrestrial planets, and their orbits are quite strongly excited by the instability, and they start colliding. Oh, I should explain. I should have explained this sooner, but just in case, when you see these kinds of plots of orbital distance versus time, and there's 3 lines for each object. So they usually show the semi-major axis and the aphelion and the perihelion for the same object. So if all 3 lines are on top of each other, that's a circular orbit. And if they're very far apart, that means the orbit has a very high eccentricity. And so what you can see, like in this example, is at the beginning, the planet's orbits are all mostly circular, and after the instability, they get excited. And so given that a late giant planet, instability disrupts the terrestrial planets, one possible solution is that the instability happened early, and it would happen during the terrestrial planet formation, and maybe it shaped it, but it didn't happen late. because that would disrupt the planets. Okay. And there's kind of two key unknowns for the instability. They're the trigger and the timing of the instability. And really they're related because the trigger had to happen at a given time. And so they're really interconnected. You can't really treat them as completely separate things. But I didn't want to make a slide with just one bullet. So there you go. So in terms of the timing, I'm not going to go into this in detail because it's not really my specialty, but there's been a flood of papers recently arguing against the terminal lunar cataclysm interpretation. It's more likely to be a sampling bias. And if you look at this plot here, there's been different kind of ways of interpreting the lunar crater record. The cataclysm was this very, very pronounced spike. There were other interpretations that were kind of more of a sawtooth shape. And then, then there's the good old, just kind of smooth decline that happened to pass through there. And current new studies are all converging on the smooth decline. Right? And what does that mean? Well, the instability is still a very powerful tool to explain a lot of stuff in the solar system. So we still think it happened. But when did it happen? Well, it had to happen early, because if it had happened late, we would have a real spike. And we don't think that spike was really there anymore. And so how can we constrain when it happens? There's some very clever ways of doing this. And so I've just listed a few of them using survival of binary Jupiter Trojans, using highly siderophile elements and some other stuff, reset ages in meteorite parent bodies. All of those all point to an earlier instability. They can't pinpoint exactly the time, but instability earlier than at least 100 million years, maybe much sooner than that. And in terms of the trigger, for the NICE model, let me just go through the triggers that have been proposed in the past. There was the resonance crossing. There was kind of this other mechanism which involved a slow angular momentum transfer at a distance between the planets and a planetesimal disk. Or there was, just self-instability. Maybe the planets right after the disk went away just went unstable on their own. And each of those had some issues. The resonance crossing, has the issue just that the initial orbits were not really consistent with migration in the gaseous disk. Although, as we saw, there's ways of constructing it so it sort of works. The angular momentum transfer idea can vary a lot. It's not always unstable. It's a very tricky one that is not convincingly fit all the constraints, basically. And the self-unstable idea can work. But it's kind of a yes or no thing. In general, systems go unstable quickly or not at all. Right? So then it's another coin toss. Maybe this happened, maybe not. So this was all introduction to this point to present this new idea that we have. So the new idea is basically, it boils down to a new trigger for the NICE model or giant planet instability. And the very, very simple idea is that if you take into account the fact that we don't think gas disks dissipate uniformly, we think they dissipate, they're photoevaporated from the inside out. That photoevaporation and the movement of the inner edge of the cavity, basically, and so kind of the opening of that hole as the gas disk goes away, we think can trigger instability, and it triggers it by pushing the planets around into an unstable spot where they go unstable almost all the time. So let me explain. So orbital migration, this is what happens earlier while planets are still embedded in the gas disk. Okay? I'm not going to go into all these details, but the key thing to know is during migration, there's these different torques acting on a planet. All right, and they come from different places, from spiral density waves. And the most important one that we need to talk about here is from the co-orbital region. And so what this plot here on the top right is showing is just kind of flow lines. And what happens here is gas flows inward. It has a close approach to the planet. It gets kicked inward. Then it goes around here. It has another close approach to the planet, gets kicked outward. Okay? And so that's the same gas that you can see in the blue lines down below. And so you can see as the gas flows inward and gets kicked inward, the gas gets kicked inward. So the planet gets kicked a little bit outward. And then the opposite thing happens here. The gas gets kicked outward, so the planet gets kicked inward a little bit. Now let's look what happens as the gas disk is going away and a planet kind of is right at the edge of the disk. what happens then? Oops. Well, it's the kind of the same idea. Basically, it's this cartoon on the right. You can ignore the part on the left. This part on the right, these kind of arrows, it's the same thing we saw before, right? Gas comes close to the planet, gets kicked inward, but then the gas is inside the cavity. It actually goes away very fast. So it never gets a chance to do the second part. So the gas goes inward, it gets kicked inward by the planet, so it kicks the planet outward. And then that's all. So what that does is it changes the torque balance in the disk, leading to a net, quite strong positive torque. So planets that are embedded in the disk, like the ice giants, like Saturn for most disk models, actually get a very strong positive torque and get pushed outward as the cavity approaches them. This does not work for Jupiter because Jupiter is so big that it carved a gap in the disk. And so there was no gas to do these horseshoe things. Right? So Jupiter's mode of migration is different and we don't need to talk about it. But Jupiter wouldn't really feel the rebound, this effect very much. Okay? So this idea, this kind of rebound effect has already been, it was developed by Babevu a few years ago, looking at very close-in exoplanets. They're, exoplanets very close to their stars that are close to the magnetospheric cavity of their star, of their disk, right? Oops. And here's a nice animation that he made. So as that cavity expands, you can see this planet migrated inward and then it's kind of gently pushed outward, right? So as that cavity expands and the disk is dissipating at the same time, that planet gets pushed outward. That's basically the whole thing. That's what this rebound effect is. It's just the cavity of the disk expanding and pushing planets along with it. That's the whole idea, really. And so we're applying it to a slightly different place, not really close to the star, but further out past, where that inner edge of the disk is sweeping outward. And so this cartoon on the left shows the general idea. The simple kind of cartoon idea is that the disk, while the disk is dense and there's a lot of gas in there, the gas does its thing, it accretes on the star, it gets blown all over the place. At some point, the density drops enough that high energy photons from the star actually carve a hole in the disk and basically chopping the disk in half. The inner part has a very, very short viscous timescale, so it drains away fast. And then for the rest of the evolution, it's this bottom panel where the outer part is just going outward. So it's basically an inner hole. It's like a donut whose hole is getting bigger in time, right? And we have plenty of images of this type of process that we think is happening right now. They're often called transition disks that are observed around other stars. Like here's one example. So back to our story. So the cartoon version of the story looks like this, right? So Jupiter's formed, the gas giant, Saturn and the ice giants have kind of started migrating. They migrated in, caught up to Jupiter, probably form a resonant chain. Then the disk is starting to get chopped in half. So a hole starts to get chopped in half here. I still feel like I could have drawn this better, but anyway, it's too late. So disk starts getting chopped in half here, and then that inner cavity is kind of going to grow in time. And so it starts sweeping past the planets. It sweeps past Jupiter, but it doesn't really do anything, right? Maybe it shifts a tiny bit, but not much. Then it gets to Saturn. And at least in most of our disk models, we did test the other case, but in most of our disk models, Saturn has not cleared a gap. And so Saturn actually gets pushed outward by the inner edge of the disk, right? What does this do? It basically squishes it into the ice giant's orbits. All right, what does that do to them? Well, the orbital stability of a system depends on how close planets are to each other. If you squish them closer and closer to each other, at some point it breaks and they go unstable. And that's what happens. And then you have an instability and then the outcome is very similar to the typical Nice model thing. It's just the gas caused the instability to happen. So this is basically the whole idea of our paper. So we tested this, quite a bit. There's some time scales here. So the time scale for the gas's lifetime is a few million years, maybe 3 or 5, and then the disk dispersal time scale is a few 100,000 years. And so here's an official plot showing what I just told you happens. And so what you see is the orbits of the giant planets. In this case, the dashed line right here, the black dashed line, this is the cavity edge. So this is the disk's inner edge that's expanding. And so to start off, we kind of like let the resonant chain form and do its thing. In this case, there is an extra ice giant, as you can see, the gray one that is going to go away. The edge sweeps past Jupiter, and you can see a little blip. So it does excite Jupiter's eccentricity a tiny bit, but not much. Then it gets to Saturn, and you have to kind of squint in there a little bit for this part. As it gets to Saturn, you can see Saturn gets pushed outward with the with the expanding edge of the disk. And then you can see all the ice giants, their orbits are all going outward there too. And their eccentricities are increasing really fast. This is what happens when you squeeze planetary systems together. There's a million studies showing this. You squeeze them together, basically the planets go together, but their eccentricities grow until they cross and they go past the limits of stability, and then boom. Then planets' orbits cross, they scatter. In this case, the innermost ice giants got scattered. You can see the perihelion is close to Jupiter's orbit. So it's Jupiter that does the ejection in the end and finally gets ejected after, I don't know, 800,000 years or something like that. And the surviving planets end up pretty close to their final orbits. And so this is one example that works pretty well. And what's kind of neat here and a little different is that there's no planetesimals in this example, right? We know that Kuiper belt exists, so their planetesimals should play a role. And I'll get to that in a sec. But in this example, planetesimals are not needed, right? There's still enough gas left to damp the eccentricities of the surviving Uranus and Neptune enough to be close to their current values. So the gas can do a lot of what the planetesimals were called to do in previous models. Not everything, but a lot. And so I don't want to keep you too long, so I'll kind of speed up a little bit. We went through a bunch of different success criteria for the simulations, and we use these kind of simple metrics. The red star is the solar system, and we tested many different things. We tested different resonant chains for the giant planets, different numbers of planets, and then a bunch of different parameters related to the gas disk dispersal and stuff. And so just to illustrate very simply, the two on the left here are cases with this rebound effect. The ones on the right, we allowed the gas disk to dissipate uniformly everywhere. Okay, and so what you can see is you get a lot closer to the red stars with the ones on the left than the ones on the right. All right, that's great. But more important is the instability rate is more than, it's about twice as high among the cases with this rebound effect. So when the gas goes away smoothly, sometimes sometimes the system goes unstable on its own. There's plenty of self-unstable systems, maybe 40%. But with the rebound, it drives instability in 90% of the time. So 9 out of 10 is a lot more satisfying than 4 out of 10. And so this kind of just to make the point that rebound really does trigger the instability quite reliably. There's an interesting possibility that I'll just mention as a tangent, which is that we did a lot of simulations with just the 4 planets. So kind of rewinding to earlier versions of the Nice model where no ice giants were ejected, and we had pretty good success with them. And so there's this kind of, within the context of this rebound model, there's the possibility of a relatively weak instability where the planet's orbits are spread out by this effect, by the rebound effect, without having as strong an instability, no instability strong enough to actually eject the planet. So that's a little aside to kind of plant the seed in your head if you're interested. And like I said before, we did run a bunch of simulations with planetesimal disks also because we believe they exist. We do believe that the Kuiper belt actually exists. And so what we did here is for the current batch, we have other ones that are running now that'll do this more self-consistently. But for this paper, what we did is did it in 2 steps. Basically, simulated the first part up to 10 million years where it's just the gas driving an instability. And then we plopped in a planetesimal disk with a different, testing different masses for that planetesimal disk to see how it affected the final systems. And so this is just one example. And so what you can see is kind of on the left part of the plot, like we saw before, the gas disk dispersal causes the system to go unstable, spreads out the planet's orbits, but they're still relatively eccentric. You can see that because those lines are relatively spread apart, especially for the innermost blue ice giant. Then once the planetesimal disk shows up, that causes a little bit more spreading of the planet's orbits and a little bit more damping of the eccentricities. And so in terms of these metrics that we were using to quantify, how close the giant planet system came to its current one, it makes the fit a bit better, right? And it works best when there's maybe 5 or 10 Earth masses in an outer planetesimal disk. That seems to be the sweet spot. Oh yeah, these words are just to say the words I already said. So the key thing being in this model, the gas triggers the instability, but there still is a Kuiper belt, so there are still planetesimals around. And the model can match the giant planet's orbits pretty well. So this is analogous to the plot you saw before of where the triangles and circles are simulations and the stars are the actual giant planet orbits. So we can get pretty close on all of them. We do have the same kind of problem as before, where we do not match Jupiter's eccentricity that reliably. And so I think the answer to that, the most appealing answer anyway to that, is that Jupiter's eccentricity may have been excited a little bit, at least earlier during the gas disk phase. And there's some ways that can be the case. One open question that the referee had for us, which is a very good question, and that's a really important one, and actually is a key thing for how general this idea is or is not, is whether instability would still happen in very low viscosity disks. And so why do we care about viscosity anyway? It's because what I've been shown to this point are cases where Saturn did not open a gap. So Saturn is affected by the rebound effect. But what if it's very low viscosity or very low scale height disk? Those are connected anyway. Then Saturn would have a much less effect from the rebound mechanism. And so would you still cause any instability? And what we found is that yes, it still works. And so these are the parts of parameter space we tested. These are basically contours of where in parameter space the different planets open gaps. And so we tested, our main tests were where Jupiter opens a gap, but not Saturn or the other planets. But then we did other tests where different combinations of planets open gaps in the disk. And oh yeah, then I guess I did that. And here's just kind of one example to show how this works, is that we still found a large fraction of systems going unstable, a slightly lower one than before, but still more than when the disk dissipates on its own. And so what happens is migration is generally stronger and faster. And as you can see here, early on, the disk sweeps by Jupiter and Saturn. Saturn is no longer getting pushed outward, but the ice giants' orbits are still perturbed enough to trigger an instability in the ice giants, and then that instability propagates to the gas giants. And we did a statistical study of this, and it happens reliably on a kind of characteristic time scale that you probably don't care about. So let me get to kind of the last kind of key point, which is a comparison between the Nice model and the rebound model. All right. So the key thing being whether gas is key or not, right? So we can look at a few different metrics. What's the instability trigger? In the rebound model, it's the gas. In the Nice model, it's something connecting the planets and the planetesimals most likely. Or there's still a possibility it's just the planets on their own, which is actually the most reliable one, but that's a separate idea. When did the instability happen? This is perhaps the most important part. So in the Nice model, right, this is kind of hard to constrain. If the system is self-unstable, the most likely time for it to go unstable is pretty fast. But if it's due to other planetesimal interactions that could be slower, it's very hard to pin down. In the rebound model, it's much more specific. It's basically when the gas is dissipated. It's, T equals 5-ish million years, maybe 10 million years, but not later, right? It's tied to a physical thing that has a time scale that is actually constrained by astronomical observations. That's pretty appealing. Right? Is the planetesimal disk needed? In the Nice model, of course. In the rebound model, yeah, it's needed. We know the Kuiper belt exists, and it helps to match the giant planets' orbits, if there's something like 5 or 10 Earth masses and stuff. It's a lot less massive than in the Nice model, but you still need some planetesimals there. And so in terms of the solar system timeline, this is a very simple timeline for solar system evolution. I took this from a review talk where I was talking about all these different things. The key thing is, if you look at time in this arrow going from left to right, there's a gas disk phase, giant impact phase, sweep up phase. And the idea as of just a few years ago, maybe 5 years ago, was that after this kind of sweep up phase was this terminal lunar cataclysm, this bombardment, this spike in impacts. And so the key change that has happened, not just because of this model, but in general, the whole community, is that this is moved much sooner. And so our model proposes that it doesn't just move much sooner, but it moves to a specific place in this diagram. And finally, kind of the last thing I'll mention is that an early instability feeds nicely into the early instability model for terrestrial planet formation. And so that idea is basically shows that instead of destroying the planet's orbits, if the giant planet instability happened while the rocky planets were still growing, it can explain their orbits and explain in particular why Mars is so much smaller than Earth. It's kind of it's an alternative to the Grand TAC model. And so what you're seeing in this image are snapshots from a simulation by Clement et al. Basically showing, T0 here is when the gas disk went away, and it didn't go away in the rebound way, it went away in a smooth way. But anyhow, the instability was triggered 1 million years later. And what you can see, kind of if you squint, is that the asteroid belt and Mars's feeding zone are very strongly depleted by the giant planet instability, much more so than the Earth-Venus zone. And so in this simulation, the final kind of the mass ratio of the two outermost terrestrial planets is very close to that of, the Mars to Earth mass ratio. So it does a good job of matching the statistical distribution of the terrestrial planets and the giant planets at the same time. It's a quite nice model. And I guess my real final thing is, I think it makes sense that this kind of instability might be pretty ubiquitous out there. Because super Earths, we know that their orbital distributions are sculpted by dynamical instability. Rebound is a candidate for triggering those. Gas giants, like I said before, are sculpted by instability. At least 3/4, maybe 95% of all giant exoplanet systems had an instability. And the only thing that really is needed for a rebound-triggered instability to happen is one planet to be below the gap opening limit. So one planet to really get pushed around as the cavity expands, because that can push it close to another planet, trigger an instability that propagates, and then boom. So I will stop there. Sorry for the technical issues, and thank you for your attention. And questions welcome.
Very nice presentation, Sean. Very, very clear. You made a complete review on the subject. That's great.
Thanks.
And so now we are open for questions. So please raise your hand or start speaking. Anybody would like to make a question? Ernesto, please.
Congratulations for your presentation, Sean. Very nice presentation. I'm a little concerned about the formation of these irregular satellites. As in your model, there are few orbital crossing of the giant planets. Is there any?
Oh yeah, that's a good point. I mean, we haven't gone and tested. So you're asking whether in this kind of rebound-triggered instability, there would still be the capture of the irregular satellites?
Yes.
Is that your question? So the answer is
yes.
To be tested. I think the answer will be yes. So the thing that's kind of cool and kind of annoying at the same time is, right, the number of parameters we have is a lot, because there's parameters not only with respect to where the initial chain of resonances of the giant planets was, there's also parameters related to the gas disk. And so the number of kinds of instability that we get is very broad. And so this would be a really interesting thing to see. Maybe that gentle instability I was talking about wouldn't work for some reason. Maybe you wouldn't have enough close encounters to have the capture of irregular satellites. I'm not sure. So that remains to be tested. A key thing to know, though, is that the gas drag timescale for 100-kilometer scale planetesimals is still very long. By this point, it's long. It's like 100 million years. And so there's not the concern that, planetesimals will still be scattered all over the place, basically, even though, there's still some gas there. But good question.
Thank you. Congratulations for your presentation. Thank you for your answer.
Well, thanks.
Okay, Ernesto. Anybody else? Rogerio, please.
Ari, I know you would expect me to ask something, but
I would hope so, yeah.
yeah, no. So no, it's kind of cool. Yeah, I mean, like I looked over the paper, but I haven't actually seen all the explanations around. So could you come back to the plot where you showed actually like the rebound, like the inner edge of the disk going outwards?
Yeah, one of these ones? Or a
Yeah,
different
one
one?
of these ones. It could be one of the previous ones. So
Like that one?
yeah, it could be that one. It's fine. So yeah. So I'm not very concerned on the irregular satellites because I mean, like you have encounters there. So as soon as you have planetesimal around, you would capture. I'm just want to know what your thoughts like on the Kuiper belt, because if the instability is happening this way, there will be gas when Neptune gets scattered around. So the Kuiper belt would kind of cool down a little bit as well. So would then need to be the case that Neptune would have to be scattered, say, like a little bit within 30 AU and then just the tail migration of Neptune that would sculpt it afterwards, or?
That's a good question. So the answer is we haven't tested it yet.
Yeah, no,
And
no.
I suspect this type of evolution might not work, like you're saying, for the reasons that you're saying, that Neptune gets kicked outward and then it kind of doesn't move at all. If instead it was this kind of evolution, right?
Yeah.
So obviously this is kind of contrived because the planetesimal disk only shows up after 10 million years. But this kind of evolution can happen where the gas kind of kicks Neptune outward, and then there's a little bit of a slower phase of planetesimal driven migration at the end, like kind of in this little tail here.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of thing I can imagine helping with sculpting the Kuiper belt, capturing Pluto and all that stuff.
Yeah, that could be. That could be. Yeah, that's why I asked him. Like maybe if you have this stability, Neptune lands at say like 25 AU or something, and you still have like 10 Earth mass left, that could do the job eventually. Yeah. And also one more question. Like if you, I think you like when you go to the low viscosity disks, the same plot in the low viscosity case.
Yeah, where's that one?
Yeah, that one. So in this one, you actually push Neptune away, which is kind of interesting too.
Yeah.
It could work in the same way. Yeah. No, it's just because now I'm thinking about the Trojans. Because
right.
To capture the Trojans, you need to have Pisa and D's scattered already into the Jupiter-Saturn zone. And if the instability goes boom, like when you are very compact, you don't have enough time to kick them inwards. But in that case, you may actually do it.
Well, that's a good point. These are good constraints. Like, clearly it can't just be any old instability. It has to have a certain pattern to match what we see.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
does that pattern fall within the realm? It seems like it does, I think.
Exactly. I know. I mean, like that's kind of cool. I mean, I don't expect that you have done everything because you just can't do everything. But it seems to fit. It would be cool to test those things if we can find somehow a way to do it. But I think it's kind of interesting.
Yeah. So the earlier the stuff in the paper was all done in kind of 2 steps, and now we have a new code where it's basically all the torques and everything, and the evolution of the disk is incorporated into a version of Mercury, the M-body code. And so now it's doable to test these things much more easily.
Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah, no, cool. Thanks a lot.
We can talk about it if you want.
Oh yeah, I'm very interested. Yeah, if you want to chat about it, yeah, cool. Sounds good. Thanks.
Thanks. I was thinking about exactly the same 3 questions about the irregular satellites, the Trojans, and the Kuiper belt. So everything you have already commented on that. But so any other question? Anybody? Any comment?
When I presented this in Nice, Tristan Guillot corrected my naive interpretation of trying to explain exactly why disks photoevaporate from the inside out. I had learned a very simple way to understand why the cavity is carved in a given spot, and it turns out it was too simple. So if anyone has one of those to explain something better, it's welcome.
Okay, we have one question here from Adrian Rodriguez. Is the jumping Jupiter no longer necessary in the scenario?
Good Good question. I mean, to explain things like the irregular satellites, it helps a lot. Are there cases where there's no encounters between the planets? I think formally you wouldn't necessarily need it to explain the giant planets' orbits in this scenario, but I think you'd still need it to explain the small bodies. And we still get a lot of those cases where there's scattering among the giant planets. So I think you'd still have the jumping Jupiter, basically. I think it's constrained in it, unless I'm wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you basically need it to explain like the irregular satellites, like Ernesto was saying.
Okay, good. We have a comment here by Luke Dons. Thanks, this was great. So Luke, it's good to have you
Thanks,
here
Luke.
too.
It's
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody
Yeah,
else?
thank yeah, thank you. It's nice to be here. Yeah, I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks, Luke.
Okay. Good to see you again. Okay. Anybody else? Any further question or comment? So thanks again, Sean. Very interesting work. I think it's going to generate a lot of future works on these other subjects, certainly, and it seems very cool. And your presentation also, I have to say, it was great, very clear and step by step. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'd like to thank everybody, and I think we can finish the seminar by now.